They spat on him in the town square, not because he stole or lied or killed, but because he dared to save a woman. Her name was Evangeline Porter, 19, eyes like winter sky. She was almost lost that morning behind Mackenzie's general store, cornered by 3 drifters with knives and intentions darker than the alley they dragged her into. But before they could finish what they'd started, Silas McGraw came out of the shadows. And when the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, it shone not on a rescued girl or a grateful town, but on a broken man standing alone as the people he thought were his neighbors hurled judgment like stones. You want to know what makes a hero. It isn't the fists he used to fight, or the blood he shed to protect someone else's dignity. It's the moment when every voice turns against him and he still refuses to bow, because that's what happened in Cedar Ridge. A man did the right thing, and the town made him the villain. This is not just a story about right and wrong. It's about what happens when decency gets punished, when silence becomes survival, and when a girl in a blue dress carries the kind of secret that can save or destroy a whole town. So don't look away now, because by the time the sun sets on this dusty street, 100 horses will crest that ridge. And the same people spitting on Silas McGraw will be down on their knees begging for his forgiveness. And the only question left will be, give it to them. He saved her life. And for that, they nearly destroyed his. They called him a brute, a troublemaker. Some even said he staged the whole thing for attention. But Silas McGraw hadn't asked for any of it. He woke up that morning the same as any other fed the horses. Checked the fence line, boiled black coffee thick enough to chew. Just another sunrise on the edge of Cedar Ridge. The world was quiet, simple, predictable, until he heard her scream. It wasn't long. Just a second of pure animal fear carried on the wind. But it was enough to make him drop the tin cup, still steaming, and run like the war had found him all over again. Behind Mackenzie's general store, 3 drifters had cornered a girl young, frightened, clutching at the bodice of her blue dress like it could shield her from everything wrong in the world. He didn't ask questions. He just fought. No weapons. Just fists, boots, rage, and the memory of every woman he'd ever failed to save. When it was over, 2 of them crawled, 1 ran, and the girl Evangeline Porter was shaking in his arms, whispering, "Thank you," like a prayer she didn't believe would be heard. But the real fight started hours later, in the town square. There Silas stood, bloodied and bruised, with dried mud on his knees and judgment in every stare around him. The girl he saved sat silently on the church steps, her eyes fixed on the dust between her shoes. Not one person asked what happened. Not one person thanked him. Instead, they talked about her reputation, about how it looked, about what people might say. Old Mrs. Hartwell's voice rang sharpest. Alone with a man like him behind the store. What else were we supposed to think? They called him reckless. They said he'd compromised her. That a man with hands so rough couldn't possibly have good intentions. No one mentioned the knives, the screams, the fact that the drifters vanished before sunrise, like snakes slipping back into tall grass. Sheriff Donovan wagged his finger in Silas's face like a schoolteacher, his badge glinting in the sun. "You had no right to lay hands on them men. This ain't your battlefield, McGraw." But Silas just stood there, hat in hand, eyes low, heartbreaking. Not for himself, but for a town too scared of scandal to recognize a rescue. They didn't see a veteran with scars. They saw a man who didn't belong. And in that silence, with every pair of eyes turned against him, Silas McGraw learned something. Being decent doesn't make you safe. Sometimes it just makes you a target. He didn't speak when they told him to leave. Didn't raise a hand when young Tommy Fletcher threw the first stone. He just turned slow and steady and walked back toward his wagon. What he didn't see, what no one saw, was the girl on the church steps lift her head. Evangeline Porter, the one with the secret, the one whose silence by dawn tomorrow would have the whole town on its knees. Evangeline Porter didn't cry. Not when they called her a disgrace. Not when Mrs. Hartwell's cane tapped the step beside her like a judgmental metronome. Not even when the first stone flew past Silas McGraw's shoulder and struck the church wall behind her. She just sat there, hands folded back, straight eyes, watching the dust rise with each insult. It wasn't the first time she'd been surrounded by voices trying to decide what kind of woman she was. and it wouldn't be the last. What the town didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that Evangeline Porter had been fighting a much quieter war, long before Silas stepped between her and those drifters. She hadn't come to Cedar Ridge by accident. She wasn't just a sweet young seamstress looking for work. And she most certainly wasn't helpless. 3 nights before, she'd slipped away from a carriage on the northern trail. Her fiancé, Marcus Thorne, wealthy, powerful, cruel, in ways that didn't leave bruises but left scars all the same, had fallen asleep drunk beside her. She'd waited until the moon was high, then vanished into the dark with nothing but a coin pouch and her mother's locket tucked against her chest. She'd planned to stay hidden, to become invisible in the quiet corners of the frontier. Just a nameless girl behind a sewing table. No past, no future, just peace. But the world had other plans. And when those men grabbed her behind Mackenzie's store, all the strength she thought she'd rebuilt in herself shattered like a dry twig underfoot. She didn't scream out of fear. She screamed out of shame, because even in that moment, part of her wondered if this was the price for trying to choose her own life. And then he came. Silas McGraw. Big, weathered, angry for all the right reasons. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't hesitate. He just saw a woman in danger and stepped between her and the darkness. And now they called him the Danger. Evangeline's silence wasn't cowardice. It was calculation, because she knew something they didn't. Her name, her father, General Augustus Porter, and what he would do when he heard how Cedar Ridge had treated the man who saved his only daughter's life. She could have stood that morning and shouted the truth. Could have stopped the crowd cold with a single word, General. But that would have stolen the lesson from them. And from Silas. So she waited, watched, let the people around her reveal who they truly were, who they always had been, when no one powerful was looking. And when the time was right, she'd speak. But not to defend herself. To deliver justice, because a secret, when used well, doesn't just protect. It transforms. Long before the dust of Cedar Ridge clung to his boots, before they spat on him and called him names that stung deeper than any bullet, Silas McGraw was just a boy with a dream and a brother named James. They were farm kids from Kentucky, sons of a quiet man who died young and a mother who worked harder than most men ever did. Silas and James were inseparable, the kind of brothers who could finish each other's sentences or wrestle for hours in the barnyard over who'd split the wood straighter. They had nothing, but they had each other. Then came the war. The boys enlisted together, promises of adventure and purpose in their hearts. But war doesn't keep promises. James didn't make it back from Gettysburg. Silas did. But not all of him. What returned was a man with eyes too old for his face and nightmares that didn't need darkness to appear. He wandered after that. Fought in bar rooms when sleep refused him. Drank through 3 winters in Kansas. Worked cattle in silence, broke horses with a rage he never explained. But somehow, between the grief and the guilt, he kept one thing, a thread of decency, tattered thin, but unbroken. That's what led him to Cedar Ridge, a place just quiet enough for an old soldier to rebuild a fence line, and maybe forget how much blood his hands had known. He bought a small patch of land, nothing but scrub and stubborn earth, and named it 3 Cedars after the trees he planted by the porch. No one helped. No one offered welcome. But that was fine. Silas hadn't come for company. He came to survive. So when Evangeline screamed that morning, when his boots pounded the dirt toward danger like they had 100 times before, he didn't think about consequence. Didn't wonder what the town might say. He just remembered the way James had looked the last time he needed help. And this time, Silas swore he wouldn't be too late. But Cedar Ridge didn't want a hero. Not one who looked like him. Not one who had scars he didn't try to hide. They saw a man with blood on his knuckles and dirt on his boots, and forgot to ask why. And yet, Silas never raised his voice, never fought back when they cursed him. Because somewhere deep inside, he still believed something his mother used to say: "You don't do right for reward, Silas. You do right 'cause it's right, even if no one sees it but the sky." And that's what hurt most of all. He'd done what was right, and they'd still burned him for it. He stood by the edge of town that evening, packing the few things he owned into a wagon older than some of the children who'd thrown rocks at him. He wasn't angry. Not really. He was just tired. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the next sunrise would bring a reckoning. Not for him. For them. In the cool hush of early evening, Cedar Ridge sat smug in its silence. The townsfolk had cast their votes not with ballots, but with glances, whispers, and the sharp edge of shame. And when the council met behind the double doors of the old schoolhouse, it wasn't to seek justice, it was to protect their own. Mayor Hutchkins, round-faced and red from indignation, had already made up his mind. Sheriff Donovan, boots propped on the table like he owned the very laws he ignored, didn't argue. Even Pastor Williams, once a man of scripture, nodded quietly. When the final decision was read aloud, Silas McGraw was to be driven out. For the good of the town. But what was the town, exactly? A handful of clapboard buildings, a dusty street that baked under the Texas sun, and people more concerned with appearances than with truth. They didn't ask what really happened behind Mackenzie's store. Didn't press Evangeline for details, because the truth might have forced them to look inward, and that was something they weren't prepared to do. Instead, they clung to the easiest lie that Silas had gone too far, that his violence, however well meant, was unbecoming of a gentleman, that he had shamed her. The rumors twisted fast. Some said he'd planned it with the drifters. Others whispered about what had happened during that hour he spent alone with Evangeline after the fight. They ignored her silence, twisted it into complicity. They painted a picture of corruption that was easier to digest than the truth that they'd failed her, and a stranger had stepped in when they should have. Even the children parroted the lies, tossing pebbles at the back of Silas's wagon as he passed by, mimicking their father's curses with childish cruelty. But perhaps the cruelest part wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't. No one stood up. No one said, "Wait, maybe we're wrong." No one reminded them that Silas McGraw had fought for their country, buried his brother at Gettysburg, and bled for a town that never once bothered to learn his story. They saw the dirt on his coat, not the reason behind it. They saw the blood on his hands, not the choice he made to use them for protection instead of harm. They saw a man who didn't fit and cast him out like trash on the wind. And so, with nothing but a quiet nod, Silas climbed onto his wagon and rode north, the wheels creaking over the packed dirt, each turn taking him further from the place that never gave him a chance. What they didn't see, what none of them had bothered to notice, was the girl in the telegraph office across the square, Evangeline Porter, her blue dress now dust-stained, her hands trembling not with fear but with resolve. She placed a silver coin on the counter and wrote a name they would all remember by sunrise. And with that single message, the truth began its march back toward Cedar Ridge, on hooves in uniform and carrying justice with the weight of steel. The old telegraph operator, Samuel Morse, not the inventor, just a man with a similar name and slower hands, adjusted his spectacles when Evangeline Porter stepped through the door. He'd seen her before. Quiet, respectful, always with her hair in a tidy braid and her chin tucked like a girl raised to follow, not led. But today, something in her presence made him sit up straight. She didn't flinch, didn't fumble with her words. She walked to the counter, placed a silver dollar heavier than a week's wages on the scarred wood, and slid a folded slip of paper toward him. "I need sent with urgent priority," she said softly. Samuel unfolded the message. His eyes caught the name at the top and widened like he'd seen the devil's own signature. To General Augustus Porter, Fort Richardson, Texas Military District. His mouth dried instantly. His voice cracked. You're related to that General Porter?" She met his eyes. "I'm his daughter." The room shrank, because Augustus Porter wasn't just a name whispered among cavalry circles. He was a man with teeth. He'd crushed entire uprisings with steel and silence. Towns that crossed him learned to rebuild from ash if they were lucky enough to be left standing at all. Samuel's hand shook as he read the short but devastating message she wrote. Attempted assault stopped by local rancher. Town persecuting hero. Require immediate escort. Departing tomorrow at dawn. Evangeline. It was simple, direct, lethal. "You sure you want to send this?" he asked, almost pleading. Evangeline didn't hesitate. "Yes, Outside, the town continued as if nothing had happened. Laughter from the saloon, a horse's soft whinny from the stable, Sheriff Donovan's boots crunching down Main Street like he still ruled it. They didn't know, not yet, that their reckoning had already been written in dots and dashes and sent flying across the wire like a thunderclap on the horizon. Samuel swallowed hard. "Does your father know where you are?" "He knows now," she said almost to herself, because she hadn't just run away from Marcus Thorne, the cattle baron her father intended her to marry. She'd fled him, escaped under cover of night. Evangeline had endured months of forced smiles, bruised ribs, and bruised spirit. But Cedar Ridge, for all its quiet cruelty, had offered her a sliver of peace until those drifters found her. And Silas McGraw had risked everything to save her. He didn't know her name, didn't ask her past. He just fought for her like no one else ever had. And now, this town had dared to punish him. Evangeline watched the window as Silas loaded the last of his belongings into his wagon, unaware that he'd just been exiled for his honor. Her stomach twisted with something between rage and regret. "Mr. Morse," she said calmly, "you might want to tell your wife not to make any morning plans tomorrow." "Why's that?" Miss Porter Evangeline didn't answer. She only looked out past the rooftops toward the northern hills and smiled, because justice wasn't coming in whispers anymore. It was coming on horseback under a general's banner with sabers sharp enough to cut through lies. They came at sunrise, not with words, not with warnings, but with hooves that thundered like war drums across the hills above Cedar Ridge. 100 cavalrymen uniforms, pressed sabers gleaming in the orange morning light, descended like a storm, summoned by righteousness itself. Dust rose behind them in a golden cloud, veiling their numbers just enough to make them feel uncountable, imposing, eternal. And at their head rode a man carved from legend. General Augustus Porter, 6 feet tall in the saddle shoulders, square beneath his dark coat beard, braided with streaks of silver like battle honors only time could bestow. His eyes were a hard gray, weathered unflinching, and cold as a January river. The town stirred in pieces. Doors creaked open, faces pressed to windows. Mothers gripped children's hands with trembling fingers. The mayor stumbled into the street in his nightshirt, white as a ghost and just as speechless. What had been a community the night before was now a congregation of the damned gathering quietly at the gallows of their own shame. No one knew why they'd come, but Evangeline did. She stood on the church steps once more, only this time she did not shrink. When General Porter dismounted, the ground seemed to shift beneath him. Each bootstep echoed like a gavel striking wood. He didn't address the crowd at first. He simply turned to his daughter. She stepped down her blue dress sweeping behind her and kissed his cheek. "Are you hurt?" he asked, without looking at her. "No," she said. "Thanks to Mr. McGraw." Then, and only then, did the general look at the town. His gaze swept across the people like a scythe through grain. Sheriff Donovan froze in place, hand hovering near his belt. But when 50 rifle barrels turned in unison toward him, he dropped it to his side like a child caught stealing. "I understand," the general said slowly, voice carrying with terrifying calm that the man who saved my daughter's life was punished for doing so. Mayor Hutchkins sputtered, his jowls flapping. "General, sir, there's been a misunderstanding. We didn't know." "You didn't know she was what?" Porter interrupted, turning sharply. "Human worthy of protection," no one answered. Pastor Williams stepped forward, Bible clutched to his chest like it might shield him. We were thinking only of her reputation." The general laughed, but it wasn't warm. "My daughter's reputation," he said, "is that she is alive. Everything else is commentary." Behind him the cavalry remained still as stone, but their silence was louder than cannon fire. These were men who'd chased Comanches across the desert, survived frontier winters without boots, buried friends beneath hard ground, and kept riding. And every single one of them would burn Cedar Ridge to the soil if the general gave the word. Where Porter asked, turning again, is Silas McGraw. The name sliced through the crowd like a blade. Sheriff Donovan's voice cracked as he stepped forward. He left town yesterday, sir. Headed north. We thought..." You'd him out, the general growled. Mayor Hutchkins was already pale, but now he looked transparent. We thought it was best for everyone involved. The general turned to Evangeline. Tell me what happened, he said gently. All of it. And there, beneath the rising sun, in the shadow of armed justice, Evangeline Porter told her story. Not just the attack, but the silence, the betrayal, the exile of the man who saved her life. She spoke clearly, proudly, and when she finished, Cedar Ridge stood silent. No more excuses, no more whispers, only judgment. And the general turned toward his captain with a voice like thunder on the edge of the world. How many men does it take to burn a town this size? The silence after General Porter's question was thicker than gun smoke. No one moved. Not the mayor, not the sheriff, not even the children who just the day before had laughed while throwing pebbles at Silas McGraw's wagon. That one sentence, how many men does it take to burn a town this size, hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. And beneath it, the people of Cedar Ridge began to see themselves clearly. Captain Morrison, the general's right hand, answered without hesitation. 20, sir. 30, if we want to be thorough. The numbers hit like rifle shots. A woman sobbed near the bakery. Pastor Williams fell to one knee, Bible trembling in his hands. The same voice that had condemned Silas for being ungodly now quivered in desperation, pleading for mercy beneath heaven and horse hooves. Please, General, he said. We made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Surely the Lord teaches forgiveness. The general didn't even look at him. The Lord, he said coldly, also teaches that a man reaps what he sows. Mrs. Hartwell, the same sharp-tongued widow who'd practically led the charge against Silas, hobbled forward with her cane like it was the only thing keeping her alive. What do you want from us? She demanded. Tell us, General. How do we make this right? He stopped pacing. His boots landed hard against the packed dirt as he turned. I want Silas McGraw brought back, he said. And I want him treated with the respect he earned, with the honor you stripped from him. Sheriff Donovan opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. The words had abandoned him, just like his conscience had the day before. He's gone, the mayor stammered. Could be anywhere by now. Then you'd better find him, the general replied. His voice was low even, but it carried the weight of command. Because if that man isn't standing in this square by sundown, I will consider this town beyond redemption. And that was it. No shouted threats, no drawn weapons, just a quiet promise wrapped in steel and smoke. People scattered like dry leaves in a storm. Search parties formed within minutes. Horses were saddled. Tracks followed. Men who'd turned their backs on Silas yesterday now scrambled through brush and dust, calling his name like lost children begging for their father to come home. But Evangeline, she didn't join them. She stood beside her father in the square, her eyes watching the northern road lips pressed into a line that betrayed nothing. Papa, she said softly, there's something you should know. The general turned to her, and for a brief second the hardened soldier disappeared, replaced by a father. I wasn't just passing through Cedar Ridge when those men attacked me, she said. I was running. His eyes narrowed. From Thorne, she nodded. I can't marry him. I won't. For a moment, the great general looked small. Not from shame, but from pain. Pain at knowing what he'd pushed her toward. But it passed quickly. The steel returned to his jaw, and he nodded once. We'll handle Thorne, he said. And then he turned back toward the horizon. Because the sun was falling. And somewhere out there on the vast plains of Texas rode a man who never should have left. And if they didn't find him before the stars came out, Cedar Ridge would answer for every stone, every whisper, and every drop of blood they'd made him bleed. They found him just as the sun kissed the rim of the hills. He was alone, as he always had been, walking beside his wagon on a narrow trail north of Cedar Ridge. His horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles back, and he'd chosen to walk the rest dust in his beard, sweat in his collar, silence on his lips. Silas McGraw had no destination in mind. He wasn't running. He just had nowhere left to go. The sound of hooves approached fast too many to be casual. He turned slow and calm, one hand near his rifle, out of habit more than fear. But what he saw made him stop cold. Mayor Hutchkins, Sheriff Donovan, Pastor Williams, and behind them, half the town. On horseback, on foot, breathless and shaken, not with anger this time, but desperation. Silas didn't speak first. He didn't need to. The mayor dismounted awkwardly, wiping sweat from his brow and pride from his face. "Mr. McGraw," he began, voice cracking, "we wronged you." The others followed, each one stammering apologies like school children caught in a lie. Even young Tommy Fletcher, the boy who'd thrown the first stone, stood with his hat crushed in trembling hands, eyes red from crying. Silas stood still. These were the same people who'd turned their backs, the same men who watched him walk away like garbage, the same women who whispered lies that cut deeper than any blade. Now they came bearing sorries like offerings at an altar, and he had every reason, every right to walk away, to turn his back on the same town that once spat on him, to let them face the fire they'd called down on themselves. But he didn't, because Silas McGraw wasn't built for revenge. He was built for something far harder: forgiveness. He looked from face to face, saw the fear, the shame, the regret, and he thought of his mother again, of the way she'd looked at him the night before he went off to war and said, "The world don't need more men who can fight Silas. It needs men who know when not to." He sighed. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. "I ain't owed anything," he said softly. "But if you mean it, if you truly want to set things right, then you'd better ride back with me and stand my side. Not just for me, but for every time you ever chose silence over truth." The mayor nodded. The sheriff looked away, and one by one they turned their horses toward Cedar Ridge. By the time they reached the square again, dusk had softened the edges of the buildings, casting the town in gold and apology. General Porter stood waiting. So did the cavalry, still and watching, hands resting on reins, waiting for the final verdict, not from the general, but from the man they had cast out. Silas dismounted in the same spot they'd humiliated him 24 hours earlier. His boots landed heavy on the ground, but his shoulders were lighter than they'd been in years. General Porter stepped forward and held out his hand. "I owe you a debt that can never be repaid," he said. Silas took the hand, calloused fingers meeting in quiet understanding. "No debt," he replied. "I did what any decent man would do." The general looked at the crowd behind him, but they didn't. The square fell silent. Every man, every woman, every child stood still, waiting for Silas to pass judgment. He looked around at the weathered faces, the bowed heads, the boy with the stone still in his memory. And then he smiled, not out of triumph, but out of mercy. The crowd held its breath. There in the same square where they'd once cursed him, Silas McGraw stood taller than any man should have to. He had every right to turn away, to leave them to their shame, but instead, he smiled. Not wide, not showy, just enough to tell them they were forgiven. Mayor Hutchkins was the first to step forward. He cleared his throat 3 times before he could speak, voice barely more than a whisper. "Mr. McGraw, I'm sorry. Truly, we were wrong." Next came Sheriff Donovan. The badge that had once gleamed proudly on his chest now sat dull in his palm. Without a word, he held it out. Silas looked at the medal, then back into the sheriff's eyes. After a pause, he shook his head gently. "I'm not here for your badge," he said. "Just your word." Donovan nodded, swallowing hard. And then they came one after another. Pastor Williams, who asked for prayer instead of offering one. Mrs. Hartwell, whose voice cracked as she begged for grace. Young Tommy, tears running down his cheeks, hands shaking as he muttered, "I didn't know." To each of them, Silas offered the same gift: silence and a nod. Not approval, not forgetfulness, just the kind of quiet only a good man can give a space to own your wrongs without being crushed by them. And through it all, Evangeline watched. When the last apology was spoken and the weight of the moment began to lift from the square, she stepped forward. No longer the girl cowering on church steps. She walked with a steadiness that came from surviving more than this town could imagine. She stopped in front of Silas and folded her hands. "Mr. McGray," she said gently, "would you consider staying in Cedar Ridge, I believe? This town could use a man like you." Silas met her gaze, not with awe or surprise, but something deeper, familiar, quiet understanding. He looked out across the crowd, people who for the first time saw him. Not just the rancher, not the loner, not the scapegoat, but the man who stood between evil and innocence and chose to stay upright. "I reckon I might," he said softly. "This place is starting to grow on me." The general stepped beside his daughter, one hand resting on the hilt of his saber, the other now extended once more, this time not just in gratitude, but in invitation. "There's a place for you with my command, if you want it," General Porter said. "Men like you are too rare to leave to the wind." Silas looked from the general to Evangeline, then back toward the rising stars above the rooftops of Cedar Ridge. "Appreciate that, sir," he said. "But I think I found the fight I'm meant to stand in, right here." Later that year, Silas McGraw became sheriff of Cedar Ridge. The town that once cast him out now called him Protector. And when he married Evangeline Porter under the open sky, not a single seat in the church was empty. Not from obligation, but from love. And in that quiet little town, they built something stronger than fences or reputations. They built a place where heroes were honored and good men never walked alone again. Years passed. The dust settled as it always does. Seasons rolled through Cedar Ridge like a gentle tide summer fields, golden and dry winters crisp with quiet snow. And somewhere along the way, folks stopped whispering about what happened that week. Silas McGraw nearly lost everything and started telling it like legend. The story changed over time, of course. They always do. But one thing stayed the same. Silas had every reason to burn the town to the ground. And he didn't. He stayed. He rebuilt. He forgave. As sheriff, he never raised his voice more than he had to. Never drew his gun unless he had no other choice. But people listened when he spoke, really listened, because they remembered what it had cost him to stand tall. And they knew this was a man who bled for them before they knew he mattered. His wedding to Evangeline Porter was held under the wide blue sky just beyond the church where she once sat alone. It wasn't fancy, but it was full. Not a soul stayed home. The same people who had once doubted her now brought gifts and blessings. And when she walked down that aisle, it wasn't just as a daughter of power. It was as a woman who had chosen strength, grace, and a man the world had almost broken. Together they made Cedar Ridge a different kind of town. Not perfect, but kinder, quieter, wiser. People started saying it was a place where justice walked slow but sure, where second chances weren't rare, where you could still find a man who'd hold the door open and a woman who'd speak the truth even if it burned. Silas never boasted about what happened, never reminded anyone of the day they failed him. But every now and then he'd catch a young boy throwing rocks too close to someone smaller, and he'd kneel beside him, hat in hand, and say, "The strongest man in the room ain't the loudest. He's the one who steps in when no one else does, and stays when it gets hard." And that boy would remember it, the way the town once remembered Silas. Some say the real Wild West was full of gunfights and outlaws. But if you ask the people of Cedar Ridge, they'll tell you something different. The truest kind of courage isn't about pulling a trigger. It's about doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. That's what Silas McGraw taught them. That's what Evangeline Porter proved. And that's why, to this day, if you ride through town and stop a while, you might still hear an old-timer say, "This place, we owe it to a man who could have burned it all down, but chose to build something better instead." If this story moved, you don't forget to subscribe, because the next one coming up is even more powerful. Click the video on screen now to hear about the widow who held a whole town hostage with nothing but the truth and a locked box her husband left behind. You won't believe what was inside. We'll see you there.